welcome to Table Talks. I'm Pastor Kori Robbins, the Associate Minister here at Orange United Methodist Church.
And I'm Adam Seat, the lead pastor here at Orange United Methodist Church, and we're thankful to have with us today the Reverend Dr. Harold Dorrell Briscoe Jr., the pastor at 6-8 Church in Durham, North Carolina, who has just released such a timely book called There's a Storm Comin, How the American Church Can Lead Through Times of Racial Crisis. So we are truly blessed to have you with us today, Dorrell. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're so excited. Dorrell, just share with us a little bit about your own context, your upbringing, how you got to this point in your journey of life.
Absolutely. Well, first, I'm married to Tracy. I've got 4 beautiful kids, 2 boys, 2 girls, Luke, Noah, Amelia, Hope, and Ella Grace. We live in Durham. We love Durham. And the church is in downtown Durham. Our church, the 6-8 Church. It started about a year ago. And the 6-8, you might be wondering what that is. It comes from the Bible verse, Micah 6-8, which most of us know. What does God want of us but to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God? Before that, before all of the church and the Durham stuff, I attended Duke University for my doctorate of ministry degree. And before that was in Florida for a long time. That's where I'm from. I'm a graduate of the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. I was on a track scholarship there, and then got my master's degree in public administration at the George Bush School at Texas A&M University, kind of focusing on urban planning, economic development, and natural disaster mitigation, which really started. That's where the genesis of this book came from. Before ministry, I've been in ministry for about 10 years, but before that, I was in government, working in local state government for about 6 years across Louisiana and Texas and Florida. And so it's it's funny, when I got around maybe year 3 or 4 in ministry, I realized, okay, I'm in it for the long haul. This is it. I remember just not getting frustrated at the Lord, but just like, why all the public admin, why all the natural disaster mitigation, climate change adaptation, all that policy stuff that I did, when the ministry is what I'm going to be, what I feel like I'm called to do for the rest of my life. Well, God doesn't waste moments in our life, right? They're integral to our journey. They inform us, they shape us. And I'm seeing that with the book right now. And so that's, I studied this stuff for nearly 12, 13 years ago in graduate school, worked in it for years, and then joined in ministry. And I was doing young adults ministry in Jacksonville, Florida for about 6 years, and then came up to Raleigh and was a campus pastor of a large mega church. And obviously now started our own church. So that's kind of how I got here.
That's great. And the reason you started coming to Durham so often was to do your doctorate of ministry, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Several years ago, as you mentioned, and so fun that we crossed paths there. I was the registrar and was there when you began, and do remember you well, but that's where this work began, that the book has developed into. And so tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book and how you began it several years ago, but now it's really, really come and been published in such a fitting time. So if you would tell us a little bit about its evolution.
Yeah, when I started at Duke, my main goal was to write an incredible doctoral thesis. I put all my eggs in that basket, and wanted to focus on that. I knew I wanted to write on some topic of leadership, potentially racial reconciliation, but I had no idea what to write about. As during the duration of the program, obviously things began to narrow, and I started to think about the crises that we were in when I was at Duke. In fact, the month after I was accepted into the program, the Emmanuel AME massacre occurred in Charleston, South Carolina. I remember driving up to South Carolina, to Charleston, a couple days after it. I was there when President Obama gave his eulogy, sang Amazing Grace. The streets were flooded with thousands of people. I was so moved. I was in such shock. It changed me profoundly. And I realized that I can't stay silent. I was in a bit of a kind of a racial hibernation, you know? I mean, just kind of doing my own thing in my own bubble, and that popped my bubble real quick. And then the year after that, what happens? Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were murdered. And another crisis that shook me out of my privilege.
Wow.
Just jolted me out of my slumber. And I realized that in that time, during those moments, a deafening silence on the part of white faith leaders. I was serving in a predominantly white church. And and I was studying, and I was around all these white churches. You know, I was a social media director at my church at the time, so I was very much in tune with what other churches were doing, what they were saying. And it was this eerie silence. And deep frustration that I saw a lot of my fellow white clergy members have. Not out of frustration at the situation, but frustration at not knowing what to do and how to lead in the situation, right? They had no idea. Like, what do we do? You know, because we got folks mad on every side. Police are mad, black folk mad. What do we do? How do we lead? So I was sitting in my class at Duke during my last semester, and I'm like, man, I got to write something about this. And I guess I had a kind of an epiphany. You know, I started thinking about this from the lens of mitigation, which is basically the act, the action of reducing the severity, pain of something, And I realized, what if we looked at these crises, right, through the lens of preparedness and mitigation? What if we were prepared? What if the church, from an organizational standpoint, work to become prepared and in a position to better lead through and respond to these storms? And I started thinking about my time getting my master's at Texas A&M and working in government in the fields of natural disaster mitigation and climate change adaptation. I started to realize that there were some parallels between climate change and the drastic shifts that we have seen change in our socio-political climate, right? I started to see that, like, climate change is creating these more intense storms, hurricanes. It's coming at a greater frequency, you know? I realized that our socio-political climate is generating some storms as well, that are becoming more intense, that are becoming more frequent. And in chapter 1 of the book, you'll read about how I named 8 factors that I believe are contributing to this profound socio-political climate change that we've had in the last 10, 15 years. Having a black president. Census Bureau projections that are showing rapid demographic shifts in America. The political ascent of Donald Trump and his rhetoric and style of divisiveness. These things have drastically changed our climate. And 3-4 years ago, when I started writing this doctoral thesis, which basically I took that thesis, cut it in half, and packaged it into a book. But 3-4 years ago, I realized, like, there's a storm coming. In fact, we were already experiencing some of those storms there. Part of my thesis was written during Charlottesville. Hundreds of neo-Nazis marching openly, declaring hate. The president of the United States saying they're good people on both sides. The hurt, the pain. That's kind of where this all began. I started looking at these crises, and let's be very clear, we've always been in a racial crisis in this country. You follow the timeline and events of what's happened. We've always been in a state of crisis, but I'm talking about events that produce an enormous amount of shock and disruption and outrage across the cultural landscape in America. You know, I'm talking about the Mike Browns and Fergusons. I'm talking about the Eric Garners in New York City. I'm talking about the Philando Castiles. And you know what? Now I'm talking about George Floyd. We're talking about Ahmaud Arbery. We're talking about Breonna Taylor. We're talking about Rayshard Brooks in Atlanta, right? We're talking about shootings of unarmed Black men and women at the hands of police that generate an enormous amount of outrage and pain that's rooted in historical trauma. And I realized that, you know what, the Black church for years has had a long tradition in activism, social justice. But I realized, serving in the white American context, white American church context, and studying it for my degree program, that too oftentimes the white church has been characterized by indifference, silence, and ignorance. And frankly, the book is all about getting y'all in the game. We need you. Dr. King was saying this stuff 50, 60 years ago, and it's fallen on deaf ears. So we you know, when we look at these crises and we hear the silence, it is detrimental to the cause of justice and unity and reconciliation. And so that's, to answer your question, that's where it began. That was the genesis of it. It was seeing these crises happen, seeing the silence of the white American church, and then wondering, okay, I wonder what if they began to take proactive measures to prepare for these crises in their communities and in their congregational context. You know, what would it look like if we moved beyond a once a year sermon or once every year sermon on racism, you know, or a once a year Dr. King quote, you know, on his holiday, national holiday? What if we moved beyond that and actually really started to dig in and do the work of justice in this community? I think we would be in a better position to respond to, lead through, and learn from these crises.
Wow. Well, about a week and a half ago, you were on CNN, and
Yeah.
you did. It was awesome to get to see you on there and to hear you. And in that interview, you had an opportunity to, in a brief amount of time, sort of walk through part of your book with the racial crisis framework. And I was just wondering if you could share with that for us, because, you know, as you said, your book title is the subtitle is How the American Church Can Lead Through Times of Racial Crisis. And so what are some of those things that we could start embracing and being proactive and living into?
Yeah, thanks for that, Adam. Yeah, you know, I decided to break it down into 4 parts. I created, as you said, a framework. It's called the Racial Crisis Framework, and there's 4 R's to it. And I believe that these steps can be applied from an institutional standpoint, but also from an individualistic standpoint, from a personal place. The 4 R's are realization, readiness, responsiveness, renewal. And I borrowed these concepts from the fields of climate change, adaptation, and natural disaster mitigation. And just walking through this really quickly, it starts with realization. You know, with climate change, you got to realize that we are contributing to the problem. And if we don't do something, we are going to reap the consequences.
Wow.
Right? I mean, if we don't start to cut back on man-made carbon emissions, if we don't start to get wise on green energy, and then we're going to be facing devastating ramifications, especially in our coastal communities. That's where I worked, in Louisiana. In fact, I was inspired to go into government after Hurricane Katrina.
Wow.
That's the whole thing. That was probably the singular event that just was a catalyst behind all this. But anyways, back to the framework. It starts with realization. We've got to realize, we've got to be aware, we've got to be educated on the historical trauma that Black folks have been dealing with in this country. whether it's police brutality, whether it's wealth inequality, whether it's I'm talking about a variety of issues that point to the glaring gaps between Black and white people in this country. There's 5 things that I think that we need to realize. We need to educate ourselves in, and I talk about this in the book. The first is we need to educate ourselves on the theological and biblical case for justice. And oh man, there's so much to say about this. But you know, so many times as a Black pastor serving in a predominantly white space, I'm told that, you know what, Dorrell, you just need to stick to the gospel. Just sprinkle Jesus. That's all we need. Don't be talking about all this race stuff. We just need Jesus. So I reply, which Jesus are you talking about? Are we talking about the blue-eyed, blonde-haired Jesus with the ultra perm? You know, looking sad like someone just stepped on his pet gerbil? Or are we talking about the brown-skinned, Afro-Asiatic, Palestinian Jew Jesus who lived in the 1st century under the brutality of Roman occupation and subjugation, who had a family member that was executed by the state, that was a victim of state-sanctioned violence, John the Baptist. This Jesus can identify in our pain, understands what it's like to be marginalized, understands what it's like to be a part of a people group that is oppressed. And so if we're talking about we got to sprinkle some Jesus on it, then we got to understand that Jesus was an activist. And he had a lot to say about justice. He frequently quarreled with the powers that be from the religious context. He's the one that called Herod a fox. You know? We've got to, which Jesus are we talking about? Which gospel are we talking about? Are we talking about a gospel that's all about just salvation? Or a gospel that's all about the kingdom of light pushing back against the kingdom of darkness, pounding against the gates of Hades? What are we talking about? We've got to talk about that. We've got to educate ourselves on the theological and biblical case for justice. Next, we've got to educate ourselves on America's historical record on race. We got to learn it. We've got to commemorate it. It is amazing how folks will talk about Confederate statues and say, you're tearing down our heritage, you're tearing down our history. But yet, you'll tell Black folks in the same breath, get over slavery. Oh, that happened years ago. You know? We got to learn it. We've got to do the due diligence to really dig down deep and learn about our historical record on race. Next, we have to educate ourselves on America's present-day inequalities, present-day systemic racism. We got to learn about Flint. We got to learn about the Ferguson Police Department. We got to learn about mass incarceration. We got to realize that. We got to learn about this because it's all rooted and it contributes to historical trauma. Next, we got to learn about the the lived experience of Black people in this country. Too many times, I have seen, one of the troubles that I've seen in the church, particularly in the white American church, is this disregard for the lived experience of Black people in this country. I love the quote from Allie Henney. She's a public theologian and activist. Woo, she is sharp and fiery. And I just love studying from her, learning from her from afar on Twitter. You know, and she's one of those Twitter theologians. I don't know what you call them, but there's like a term for it. But she said this quote that's just stuck with me for years. She's like, you know, I memorized it, but I want to make sure I read it verbatim. She says, y'all trust Trump, but you need 3 doctoral dissertations, 18 sermons, an angelic visitation, kind words, 43 scriptures, the ghost of Harriet Tubman, 4 testimonies, and an affidavit signed in the blood of the slaves to believe Black people when they say they're experiencing racism.
Wow. Wow. That's
I can't say it better than that. We've been crying out for decades. But it's so hard to believe it. The overt stuff and the subtle stuff. You know, that's a whole nother conversation. But we got to educate ourselves on that, you know? And then finally, we got to educate ourselves on the ideology of whiteness. we've got to understand the social forces that are in play that create these lenses that white people use to see the world, and particularly the issue of race. The lens like hyper-individualism, the lens of anti-structuralism. You might know I'm quoting Michael Emerson and Christian Smith in their groundbreaking book, Divided by Race. Came out in 2001. I mean, if you talk about my book being timely, that book was timely and has been prophetic and amazing. I've learned so much from that book. But essentially, what this kind of Euro-American ideology and theology that we use to kind of construct the world. You know, when we talk about individualism, this storyline that basically recreates, reproduces, communicates this idea that group membership is irrelevant to individual success. It's irrelevant. It's not important. That social forces like socioeconomic status, race, gender have no bearing on opportunity that you're given. You just got to work hard. We got to talk about that. You know, we got to educate ourselves on that, how that is actually wrong. Obviously, we do need to work hard in life, but we also have to take into account social forces that are in play that set people up for a better position to do well in life, right?
Right.
I was talking to a family member about race stuff, and the family member of not my side of the family, it's on the other side of the family, but they're saying, you know, their dad fought in World War II, and they were dirt poor. They just worked hard. I was like, you know, my grandpa fought in the Korean War bravely, and guess what? When he came back, he didn't have access to the federal GI Bill.
Wow.
He didn't have access to FHA home mortgage loans to build equity and wealth. Why? Because he was Black. But yet he valiantly fought for his country. And what happened? He became a postal worker, you know, and worked hard for 30, 40 years, you know, in Rantoul, Illinois, you know. But we got to talk about the fact that your father, my grandfather, had fought in the same war. Different war, 8 years apart. But came back with different access.
Wow.
We have to educate. We got to talk about that stuff. So that's realization. And I think that, man, that is very important. I spend a lot of time on that because that is very, very important. You got to be aware. Your eyes have to be open. You need a Saul of Tarsus moment where Jesus knocks you off your horse. You know, we need heart transformation, you know, but you also need to educate yourself on what's going on. Then finally, I believe that, or not finally, but once we realize these things, we move to readiness, right? That's where we start to get ready for these crises. And we do that in the following ways. We move beyond cheap diversity into radical inclusion. We do that by investing in Black-led organizations that are working for societal change. We do that by collaborating and partnering with community stakeholders in our city that have been doing the work. I think we're stronger together. And so what does it look like for us to spend time and start to cooperate and coordinate with other organizations that are like-minded? You know, so that we have to get ready. That's when we start to do the work of justice. Your board of directors, your elder team might have to change a bit. You might have to start designating a certain percentage of your budget to go to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You might have to direct volunteer services in your church to start to work and serve alongside Black-led institutions that have been doing the work of justice for decades. But you got to get ready. You got to get your congregation ready. You got to talk about this stuff. You got to host, do sermon series, discipleship curriculum, maybe small group curriculum. Needs to incorporate this stuff throughout the calendar year so it's present in this lifeblood in the stream of your organization. So when these crises occur and everyone's mad and everyone's just raging, your people and you, the clergy, will be in a better position. You'll be in a more informed position to lend your voice to essentially be a part of the healing process. And so you got to get ready. Once you realize, you start to get ready. You get your church ready. You get yourself ready. You start to do the work. You get in there. You're meeting with police chiefs. Huh? You know, you're at city council meetings. You're advocating that we designate a certain part of the police budget to holistic and comprehensive reform and services that can help in regards of other mental health crises and other things like that. You're advocating for that. You're doing the work. At our church, at 6A Church, we go to city council meetings. We meet with community leaders. We hold the powerful accountable to make sure that they are operating in a manner that's just and contributes to the flourishing of Black and brown people in our community. So you get ready. And then responsiveness. When the crisis hits, the work you put in with realization, you becoming aware, the actual work of justice, being out in your community, being the hands and feet of Jesus, that's when responsiveness, you're more informed and you're in a better position to speak on Sunday morning when everyone wants to know what the man or woman of God wants to say.
Wow.
You know it because you've done the work. You step in that pulpit confidently, filled with moral clarity, conviction, and decisiveness. You speak truth to power. You speak with grace and truth because you understand the forces that are in play with white folks. So you're not just bashing them upside the head, right? You're speaking with grace, but also with truth. And there's a confidence that you have going in. That doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. That doesn't mean you're always going to get it right. But I guarantee you, you're going to be a part of the solution. You know, but you're responding. Your church is responding through its social media accounts, through the pulpit, through individual conversations. We have to understand the power that we wield as clergy members. And I think I got this from Bishop Willimon. I got it from somebody. I think it was Bishop, but he was my advisor for my doctoral thesis and one of the endorsements for the book. But when a crisis hits, people want to know what the man or woman got to say on Sunday morning. You know, how should we process this? What should we be thinking about? It's your job. And too oftentimes we say dumb stuff, or we don't say anything at all. And I don't, and forgive me, that I don't mean to take that. I don't mean to say that in a derogatory way. But we say things that are ignorant, or we are indifferent to the pain that people are experiencing. We can't do that anymore. The church has to take the lead. And too often times we're behind. We're behind. We're caught flat-footed. It's like Katrina. What happened? The levees broke. And local, state, and federal government had no idea what to do.
Wow. Yeah.
And people were drowning in the floodwaters. 1,833 people, I believe, was the exact near 1,800 people. And you got, when George Floyd occurs, when a Breonna Taylor happens, when an Ahmaud Arbery is gunned down for running in a neighborhood, folks are drowning in the floodwaters of fear, loneliness, outrage, and anxiety.
Wow.
And we need clergy members to get in their helicopters and be like the Coast Guard. The one bright spot in Katrina, if you can remember, was the Coast Guard. And Judith Rodin talks about this so eloquently in her book, The Resilience Dividend, how the Coast Guard had spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours in preparation for something like this. And so guess what? When the crises occurred, the Coast Guard was ready. They came in. Government wasn't ready. But the Coast Guard was. Wow. And we need clergy members to be like the Coast Guard and to strap up, get in those helicopters, and rescue people who are drowning in the floodwaters of racism, of rage, of trauma. And that is your job. And that's what we do during the responsiveness section. We need we need your voice. And then finally, renewal. When you're in this field, one thing that you learn in the field of climate change, adaptation, natural disaster mitigation, resiliency, you learn that we can't just bounce back, we got to bounce forward. We got to be smarter. How can we learn from these events? What do we need to learn about ourselves, about our organization, about our community? Where are the stress points? Where are the stress fractures? Right? The fracture, the fracture points. Right? Where are they? We got to learn about those, and we got to harness the energy of these events for greater systemic change. You know, I'm a big basketball fan. I'm an NBA fan, and they're going through this debate right now. You have a sizable contingent of players in the NBA that are like, I don't think we should resume play, because we have a moment right now where we need to harness the full energy of it and truly work for lasting change. And then there's the other contingent that are like, you know what, hey, I think we can do both, you know, play basketball and do that, you know, and that's no, you know, I'm not going to get into which side I agree on. I'm just saying that's a conversation that they're having. We're in a moment right now, and that we probably haven't seen since 1968. And so how can we lend our voice, our resources, and our organizational strength to work for the common good and the flourishing of Black people in this country?
That is so much power in what you've just said. I feel my heart so convicted. So that's incredible, and I am so grateful for the time you've shared with us today. Pastor Kori, do you have any last questions or anything?
The only thing I think we probably need to have another conversation. I mean, I feel like I've just learned so much. Just, you know, hearing you go through the process, and it's very convicting, and it does call us to action. And I think just this conversation has really resonated, and I hope that it resonates with our congregation as well. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with you.
And so people can find your book on Amazon.
Yes, sir.
So there's A Storm Comin. Reverend Dr. Harold Dorrell Briscoe Jr., we are so grateful for your time today, for your wisdom. And I, for one, want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of that. And I love the framework that you've given us, you know, to see, you know, just thinking about the Coast Guard, once again, that image is so powerful. You know, they had a realization that one day there would be a storm. Yep. And so they began to develop plans and practice. How would we rescue people in these situations? That was that work. And then they were able, when the storm came, they were able to respond. Well, for so many of us, we might just be in realization mode, and the storm's already here. And so we've got to fast forward and do the hard work required so that we might get to respond, responsiveness, and especially I love the renewal, you know, the rebirth. So thank you for your work, and I look forward to, buddy, we're going to be talking to you again.
Always here, and thankful to be a part of the Orange United Methodist family. Just you know, I have great friends from that church, and so we're thankful for the work that y'all do.
Well, thank you for what you do, and may God continue to pour out His blessings upon you and your family, your church, and all the work that you do. So,
amen. Thank you.
Thank you for your time today. Be blessed.